Lección de gramática 11.1 Mandatos familiares. We're going to start off today's lesson by reviewing the 4 sentence types in English. There are declarative sentences, which are statements, imperative sentences, which are commands, interrogative sentences, which are questions, and exclamatory sentences, which are exclamations. Today's focus will be on imperative sentences or commands. Now, commands in Spanish are a little bit more complicated than in English, and that's because of all the different kinds of you that we have in Spanish. As you know, we have tú, vosotros, usted, ustedes, so that makes this a little bit more complicated. But we're going to take this form of the imperative sentences, we're going to take this step by step. Today we're going to start off just by learning how to give commands to someone that you know on a familiar basis. So these would be two commands. These are the types of commands you would use when you're speaking to only one person. So this would be singular and familiar. Again, this is the to form. These are the forms that you'll use when you're giving orders or advice. Familiar commands can be affirmative, which I will usually represent with a positive sign, or negative, which I'll represent with a negative sign, meaning that these types of commands are used when telling someone what to do or what not to do. First, we're going to start off by learning about the affirmative commands, or the positive to commands. The rule that you use to make a verb into a command is that you're going to drop the S off of the to form, which is going to make it look just like the el or ella form of the verb. Here are a couple of examples. If I just want to say the statement, you take out your book, I would say sacas tu libro. However, if I want to tell you, take out your book, then I drop that S, so it would just be saca tu libro, take out your book. Another example of a statement would be cierras la puerta, you close the door. If I want to tell you, however, close the door, then I would say cierra la puerta. There are 8 exceptions or irregular forms of to positive commands or affirmative to commands. These 8 irregular forms are used with the verbs decir, hacer, ver, poner, salir, ser, tener, and venir. You're probably thinking, oh my, these verbs again, they seem to be irregular in almost every single form, and you'd be correct if you are noticing that. These same verbs are kind of tricky and kind of break the rules throughout all of the Spanish language. Here are how you would say these verbs in the command form. If you want to tell someone to say or tell something, you would say di. If you want to tell them to make or do something, haz. If you want to tell them to see something, ve. Pon would be telling someone to put or set or place. Sal is telling someone to leave. Se is telling them to be when you're referring to a more permanent condition, like using the verb ser. Ten would be telling someone to have something, and ven would be telling someone to come. Something to keep in mind is that the affirmative commands for ir and ver are going to look identical, so you have to use context clues and figure out what the meaning is so you know whether someone is telling you to go somewhere or to see something. Let's look at a couple of examples. Ve a la cafetería, ve esa película. Both of these commands use the word ve, but they don't mean the same thing. One of them is telling us to go somewhere, the other is telling us to see something. So if you look at the other words in the sentence, it can help you figure out what the meaning. For example, we know cafeteria is a place, and we know that a movie is something you can see, so then we can figure out the first one, ve a la cafetería, means go to the cafeteria, whereas ve esa película means see that movie. Now let's talk a little bit about the negative to commands. The way you form a negative to command is by dropping the O from the present tense yo form of the verb and add the opposite ending. Now when I say opposite ending, What I'm referring to is for an AR verb, your opposite ending would be ES. For ER and IR verbs, the opposite ending would be AS. Let's look at a couple of examples. Bailar, comer, and mentir. These are three pretty common verbs. One ends with AR, one with ER, and one with IR. Now to take these verbs and turn them into commands, here's how we'll do that. First, we're going to look at the yo form of the verb. Yo bailo, yo como, yo miento. The next step is to drop the O and add the opposite ending. So for bailar, we're going to add ES, but for comer and mentir, we're going to add AS. And then that will give us our negative to command. No bailes, no comas, no mientas. A little bit more on negative to commands. Irregular yo form verbs like the GO verbs and ZCO verbs that we reviewed maintain their same irregular form or irregular patterns in negative to commands, and as do stem changing verbs too. Here's a couple of examples. The verb conducir, which is a ZCO verb, if I wanted to put that into a negative to command, I would say no conduzcas, don't drive. An example of a GO verb, decir, I would say no digas, don't say or don't tell. Here's a couple of examples of some stem changing verbs. Oh, sorry, hacer, that's another GO verb. So I would say no hagas, don't make or don't do. Now I have some examples of stem changing verbs. Perder, the verb for to lose. No pierdas, don't lose. Repetir is an E to I stem changing verb, and I would say no repitas, don't repeat. Another thing to remember about negative to commands is that verbs that end in CAR, GAR, or ZAR have spelling changes when you add the opposite ending. This might sound a little bit familiar because we used this same pattern when we were learning about the not the present tense, the preterite tense, yo form of these verbs. So when you look at the infinitive verbs sacar, apagar, and almorzar, you'll notice that to change those to the negative to command, which means we're adding the opposite ending, we also have to have another spelling change. So the C in sacar changes to a QU in no saques. The G in apagar changes to a GU in no apagues. And the Z in almorzar changes to a C in no almuerces, don't eat lunch. There are 5 irregular commands that are the negative to commands. They correspond with the verbs dar, estar, ir, ser, and saber. Here is how you would tell someone not to do these things. If you want to say don't give, no des. Don't be when you're using the verb estar, no estés. Don't go, no vayas. Don't be when you're using the verb ser, no seas. And don't know, you would use no sepas. You'll find that the 5th one, no sepas, is not as common because it's not very typical that you would tell someone not to know something, but the first 4 are very common commands. The last thing I want to discuss is how to use pronouns with commands. When you're using a direct or indirect object pronoun or a reflexive pronoun with a command, here's what you need to remember. If it is a positive command, you will attach the pronoun to the end of the verb. For example, hazlo, make it or do it. Siéntate, sit down. Coming from the verb sentarse, which is a reflexive verb. If it is a negative command, the pronoun goes before the verb. Here are some examples. No lo compres, don't buy it. No te vayas, don't go away, coming from the reflexive verb irse. One thing you might have noticed on this page is that siéntate has an accent over the E, and you wouldn't typically have an accent on this verb. The reason that this accent mark has been added is to simply help you with your pronunciation and to make sure that the stress is still added on, or still on that same sound that it was originally on. That way you don't pronounce the word siéntate with the emphasis on the a, you keep it on the a. So you'll commonly see this accent mark added to positive to commands or affirmative to commands, but you won't see it on just the regular conjugated verb. For example, te sientas or me siento. You don't need the accent for those regular present tense conjugations.